Hey peeps, today I'm talking all things piping. Once I've got the piping made, we need to start installing it into the project. The first installation I'm going to show you is along a straight line. This is the easiest place to put piping, so it's definitely a good place to start if you've never tried this technique before. If you've never tried this technique before, I would recommend that you do a couple of test swatches, just so that you can get an idea of how the fabrics work together, how the piping's going to look, and if you're going to like it in your finished project. Once you've done your test swatches, this is how I apply piping to a straight seam. This is definitely the simplest place to add piping to this particular project. It's going straight along the straight edge of the back yoke. I'm putting it onto this piece of the pattern rather than the piece that goes at the bottom, because this piece will have gathering on it, which means if I tried to put the piping on that, I'd have to control the gathering and the edge of the piping, which is obviously more difficult. So I'm going to put the piping across the back edge. I'm going to match up the raw edge of the piping with the raw edge of the pattern piece. I do have a join there, so I think I'm actually going to start my piping a little further along. Usually I wouldn't worry too much about a join, but this is a small piece and it is a bodice piece, so I want it to look as best as possible. So yeah, I'm going to start just beyond the join, and I'm going to use my zipper foot, and I'm going to sew the piping to the back yoke piece along the previous line of stitching as close as I possibly can to get it into place. Okay, I have my zipper foot on, my walking foot or my dual feed down, just because this works for me really well, and we are sewing two separate unattached and unpinned pieces together. I do prefer to work unpinned, but that is my preference. You've got to do whatever works best for you. As you know, I also like to work from the roll, so I won't pre-cut a length of piping to fit the project that I'm working with. I keep the body of the piping in my lap. This is a scrap piece of fabric and it is a scrap piece of piping, so it is a cut off length, as you can see there. I've done this so that I can demonstrate nicely and close up for you guys exactly how I sew on piping in the very basic method, but I would recommend that you keep your piping on a roll in your lap and don't pre-cut lengths for what you would need, because you will probably end up wasting more piping than you realize doing it that way. So I have my regular zipper foot on. I've got my needle moved all the way over to the left. My piping, because I made it myself, has a flange of 5/8 of an inch from the stitching line to the raw edge of the piping. So I'm going to match the raw edge of the piping up with the raw edge of my fabric. This is for the very basic method of sewing piping in. If you are going to be sewing this to a piece of fabric that has some detail in it, for example gathering or perhaps even a dart, I would sew it onto the simplest piece of fabric first. So in this case, this would be, as you're seeing in the video, the back yoke. So you want to sew it to your simplest and easiest piece first before you start adding more interesting details like gathered sections to your piping, so that you can get the exact right amount of piping onto your piece and you don't have to worry about fitting gathers into it. I've got the raw edge of the piping matching up with the raw edge of the fabric. I have pink thread on my machine rather than green thread. All the construction of this dress I've done in green, but for the piping I want to sew it in pink, because if the stitching of the piping shows even a little bit on your project, you can go back and fix that by stitching closer to the piping core. But if you've done your stitching in a matching thread to your piping colour, it's not going to be super obvious, whereas if I'd stitched this on with green, it would be much more obvious. I'm going to lower my presser foot down, make sure my needle's as far over as it possibly can be. I like to hold on to my threads before I start stitching. Lower my needle and then take a couple of stitches. Okay, so you want to back stitch because you want to secure this into place, and then you are going to try and aim to stitch right over the thread that you have securing your core into your piping. You want to be as close to that, if not on top of that, or further in towards the core of your piping. The zipper foot will be running against the core of your piping, which is why I like having a thicker cord like string or macrame cord or proper piping cord in this rather than wool, because wool I find can be quite squishy, and so it would be easy for the foot to kind of go over the wool and compress it down, and then you won't get even piping. So I'm going to continue sewing this all the way to the end. And again, just pause, take a couple of stitches and make sure that everything is aligned. I prefer not pinning when I'm doing things like this. I will pin to start or in some situations like when you are sewing in gathering, but when you're doing straight piping like this onto a straight edge, I find that pins can actually distort the fabric and give you bumps and lumps in there that you definitely don't want. So I prefer not to pin. You could use wonder clips or anything that keeps the fabric flat if you feel more comfortable that way, but for me this works just fine. So I'm really resting the edge of my foot up against the core of my piping, coming to the end. I'm going to backstitch and take the work out from under the machine. So I want to trim off my threads, and technically I have got a little bit extra piping than I needed, so what I would do in this case if it was the real thing is I'd turn the work over and I'd use the edge of my pattern piece as a guide to make sure that I had everything nice and flush. So hopefully you can see there I've got my stitching on top of the previous line of stitching that secured the piping cord inside of this, and that just means that when we turn this over should end up with something that looks like this after it's been pressed. So that is the very fundamentals and basics of getting your piping in. Your zipper foot is your best friend. Go slow and have a matching thread to the colour of the piping that you've chosen, not the project that you're working on. You can see that I have sewn the piping on and it's going to look something like that when it's attached to the bottom of the back bodice. I just want to prep the seam allowance of my piping so it's ready to be sewn to, this part will get sewn to the back of the sleeve. So the first thing that I want to do is take my tweezers. So I'm holding on to the piping and I'm trying to like bunch back the fabric rather than pull the piping out because I don't want to disturb the piping along the length of the project. Then I'm going to take my seam gauge and I'm going to measure 5/8 of an inch, which is this seam allowance, and just snip that off. And then that piece is gone. I'm going to do the same for the other side. And like I say, again, you want to push the fabric back. You don't want to pull on the piping cord because you don't want to pull the piping cord through the channel that it's in and out of place. So this one, there was a tiny little bit sticking out, so I'm just going to chop off a tiny little bit extra. And again, this is just to take the bulk out of the seam allowance of the work so that when we sew this to our sleeves there won't be that extra bulky piece of cording in the seam allowance. So that piece is prepped. Now I can move on to the next. You always want to add your piping to the flat pattern piece, and then once you've applied the piping to your flat piece, then you're going to add the gathered section. That just makes your life way easier in my opinion. I have one large video of all of the mini tutorials back to back, so hopefully I have covered what you're looking for in that. I will link to the playlist and all of the individual videos in the description down below. But if you have any questions, please let me know in the comments section down below and I'll do my best to answer them for you. If you've enjoyed this video, you might want to check out this one here.